watching the News Hour Special Edition.
Will be mutually accepted, subject of course to national law and privacy law that countries may have. But more importantly, it has been agreed that everybody will help to optimize the processes and procedures of the WTO for vaccine approval and emergency use authorization, and will also be strengthened. The WHO will be strengthened so that they can do recognition of vaccines faster. We have also agreed to extend the debt suspension service initiative so that vulnerable countries, low-income countries, are not burdened with debt repayment at this critical time. On agriculture, we are very delighted to share with you that livelihoods for small and marginal farmers were at the focus of our discussions, and everybody has agreed that improving their livelihood is an important global effort that we all have to put in. Energy and climate was clearly the center stage of our discussions. India and many other developing countries pushed for safeguarding the interests of the developing world. We were also joined by the developed countries to increase the ambition from the current levels of commitment and active interest that the developed world has shown in terms of providing technology and affordable finance at low interest or grant-based finance, long tenor finance. So we've really got into the text the language which confirms that the developed world has acknowledged that they have not done enough in terms of meeting their commitments, and that they will have to be more forthcoming in providing finance, in providing technologies and the enablers to make the transition to a clean energy world in the future. We have also been able to encapsulate some of the actions that the developed countries need to take, and for the first time, the G20 has identified sustainable and responsible consumption and production, along with provision of finance and technology, as critical enablers for achieving the climate goals first decided at Paris, and as we have all agreed, we must aspire for even more ambition. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's mantra of sustainable lifestyles finds resonance in the Rome Declaration, and sustainable consumption and responsible production patterns coming out of the Sustainable Development Goal number 12, which is aimed at encouraging the developed countries to reduce their luxurious and energy-intensive lifestyle, has been discussed and accepted. We are very happy to share with you that we have been able to include once again and reiterate the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. We have also been able to push the commitment of the developed world to provide $100 billion every year through from now until 2025, and the commitment of all the countries to mobilize greater levels of capital for the less developed countries and the emerging economies. I am delighted to share with you that for the first time, we have also been able to put through that technologies today do not exist to be able to transition in a big way to clean energy, and innovation will play an important role in the years to come. The importance of energy security and the stability of energy markets has also been recognized at the G20 Leaders Summit. We are soon going to have another engagement on resilient supply chains, which will be attended by several countries. And for the first time, the mention of the CDRI in accelerating the agenda of sustainable urban planning has been brought into the declaration. We are delighted that what Prime Minister Narendra Modi had proposed in Brisbane in 2014 has finally been accepted by all the countries. First, the OECD discussed it. Now the G20 framework on base erosion and profit sharing has been brought out in this statement. It's truly a historic achievement for a more stable and fair international tax system. Travel needs to get reinvigorated. We need to get back people's movement, bring tourism back, bring economic activity back, and we have all agreed to work towards a common framework for accepting each other's vaccine certificates. We have also discussed gender-based violence and increasing women's participation in the workforce. Also denounced the uneven distribution of unpaid care and domestic work. So in some sense, a lot of the agenda that India was pushing for, a lot of the agenda of the developing countries in which India took a leadership role, have been representing them in the G20 for several years, has been brought into the text, along with data free flow for trust. Data for development has come into the Rome Declaration, and all the leaders of the G20 are now looking forward to the G20 presidency in India.
All right, so that was Union Minister and also India's G20 Sherpa Piyush Goyal talking about the issues, the agenda that India has set being taken into account, into consideration by the G20 leaders. Let's also go across to Danish, my colleague, who's joining us live from Glasgow. With him is activist Pushpanath Krishnamurti, who has walked 1 million steps in the last 32 days for climate justice. Over to you, Danish.
Well, yes, we are joined by a very special guest, Pushp, who has been walking and still standing tall, as you can see, to mark this momentous occasion of the COP26. Pushp, what is it that made you take this step?
I took my first step in 2009, Copenhagen, because I work with people living in poverty, and people living in poverty are exposed to extreme vulnerability. Any external shocks can really push them backwards. I found it direct experience across Asia, Africa, and so on. And it's unfair because they haven't contributed to this problem. And they've been giving up their lives and livelihoods and so on. But they are always reimagining a life of hope. So I carry that hope message, I carry the justice message, and ask for climate justice. And I have met about 500,000 people in the last 10 years. Right. Now, another million. I've already met 4,000 people, 2,000 students with many messages like this.
Right. So it's been an absolutely amazing journey. Pushp, what is it that you expect from the world leaders who are now going to gather here in Glasgow?
I think I would like leaders to become visionary, because this planet is the only planet we have. And therefore, they have to come to an agreement which is fair, ambitious, and binding. More than that, I think they need to be looking at what's happening to people already impacted. That's called adaptation. They're giving about a few 100 billion in a year. That's really pocket money. And we haven't seen the color of the money. Right. So we need technology, we need money for those women who have given up their lives but hoping for a better life and calling for justice. And that's what I'm asking.
So there seems to be also a contrast between the positions taken by the developed countries and the developing countries. And you spoke about the money that has still not come out. Is it also a case that the people in the West or in the developed economies are not able to imagine what and how climate change can really impact people? Is that also a question?
No, it used to be like that because people even started to talk about a climate apartheid. The North has done the problem, the South is really paying a price. Not anymore. I walked all across Britain and I found it's impacting. Just as I've been walking across floods, really furiously hitting part of Britain for the third time in the last 10 years. So it's not that anymore, but it's a question of words put into action. They think they can afford to be taking photo opportunity now. This is not a time for photo opportunity. It's a time for great super leadership, and all of them have the opportunity to make a fundamental change in reimagining the nature of our economy, not anymore an emission-driven economy.
That's a very important point you make, reimagining the economy. And what is it that you now expect to take place in terms of targets? We have seen the targets have been set before as well. Are the countries doing enough to meet the targets that they themselves are putting out?
I think the important thing is that we have the money. This is $100 trillion economy. And all that we need is $1 trillion. Do we have the science? Yes, we have. We have the answers for all this? Yes. Are we monitoring better? We are. The question is, do we have a political will to make this happen? Remember, it's not only about politics now. It's about a total moral failing if they fail. And it's also a spiritual journey for me, and so is for everyone.
Right. And how has been your experience walking all these journeys that you have made? What is the one message that you have got from people that you would like to share with our viewers?
The one message is an urgency of now. That's why I walk fast. Yeah, you don't have time. When I asked Chris Fong,
something that a lot of climate activists have been saying in their own way, highlighting the issue that we shouldn't only talk about fulfilling and achieving goals in 2050, but be setting goals for 2030. Danish, thank you for getting us that reaction. I want to go across to our senior editor, Monika Prasad, as well. She's joining us with the inside details of the stand that India is going to take. And all eyes are on Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Monika.
Absolutely. All eyes on Prime Minister. He lands there tonight in Glasgow, and tomorrow part of lots of meetings through the day. By evening, Swati, we should hear our Prime Minister speak twice. He is going to take the stage in Glasgow, and the point that India is going to make, to explain it in a simple manner, the point that India is going to make is that, number one, this entire concept of net zero and this push from developed countries that all the member countries should sign on net zero and decide that by 2050 they would all come down to net zero levels, to which I think India has almost made up its mind that they are not going to be a part of it. So India would most likely be rejecting net zero. That might happen tomorrow, and that would be a big headline. The second thing is that it's a country that believes that we all need the space to grow and develop. At the same time, of course, work a lot as far as renewable energy is concerned, augmenting renewable energy is concerned, in which India is doing so well that we are in fact going to exceed our target of 2030. By 2030, India is expected to be generating about 450 gigawatts of clean energy, which would be about 60% of the total requirement of the total energy consumption that India would be having by that year. So we are going to, of course, impress upon the world as to how beautifully we are working in that direction, but at the same time, we'll also be pushing harder and making our stand very, very clear that unless we have the money that was promised by these developed countries, the $100 billion, if that doesn't come our way, one cannot be pushing towards the commitment one has made in terms of reducing the carbon emission. So we need the money, and we also need to be given that kind of space, because these developed countries have already done what they had to do. They have already, the carbon peak has happened for those countries. It's not happened for India. We need our time to develop and financially become much more stable in terms of a country, and that, I think, all of these points will come forward. This pushing from the developed countries to sort of pass off the burden of what they have done over the years to developing countries, that is something India is likely to resist tomorrow.
Right. So the onus should not be only on the developing countries. The developed nations need to do more. Thank you very much, Monika, for joining us with those details. Let's go across to our guests. Let's open this up. We are joined by Sunitanarayan, environmentalist, also the editor of Down to Earth and director of CSE. We also have Dr. Vandana Shiva, scholar, environmental activist, food sovereignty advocate. Vimalendu Jha, an environmentalist, is joining us along with Debi Goenka, also an environmentalist. Good evening to all of you. I first want to come to you, Ms. Shiva. What are your expectations from this summit? What are your expectations from the G20 leaders?
Well, India has been a leader in the climate negotiations since the UN framework of climate change was established at Rio at the Earth Summit in 1992. And we laid out very clearly that it was an issue of justice. It was an issue of the rich world having caused the pollutions, and the vulnerable part of the world is our world, which hasn't contributed in the same way. And one would think that with all the globalization and outsourcing and putting all the polluting industry in India and China, the rich would have stopped polluting. But even now, the US is responsible for 40% of excess CO2 emissions. The EU is 29%, the G8 nations 85%. And as an Oxfam report showed, 10% of the rich people contribute to 50% of the greenhouse gas pollution. And the 50%, that's 3.5 billion, half of humanity, contribute to only 10%. So we are talking about a climate injustice, and I think India is going with a clear mandate to continue to fight for climate justice. I was very happy to read that India is rejecting the new trick of the rich billionaires and corporations, as well as the rich North, of net zero by 2050. We'll continue to pollute, and yet we will find new ways to take your forest, your land, in new carbon trading systems. We lost the decade of the Kyoto Protocol because they reduced reduction of emissions to emissions trading. Emissions went up, pollution did not stop. That time, it only applied to them. Now that they have included us after the collapse of Copenhagen, they would like to make us pay for their pollution. And this is what I hope India will not allow.
Right. You know, I want to bring in Ms. Narayan as well. Ms. Narayan, 2021 is being described as a make or break year. How are you looking at India's role when it comes to fighting pollution, when it comes to taking a stand on climate change?
India is clearly a country which is very badly affected by climate change. We know that. We are vulnerable. The whole world is vulnerable, but India, because of our vast numbers of people who live already at the margins of survival, we are really doubly hit. So we understand the pain of climate change. Now, what therefore should India must do, and what will be its role, the question you've asked, I think two roles we need to play. On one hand, we need to play the role of a global leader, which actually reminds the world of the need for climate justice in an effective agreement. The fact is, vast numbers of people in the world still do not have access to energy, still do not have access to development. Now, their growth, including their use of coal, will jeopardize the world further. The answer is not that they do not develop. The answer is that they develop differently. So that whole enabling role of getting money, technologies, so that vast parts of the world can develop differently on the basis of climate justice is a role that India must play. On the other hand, India must also play a role of a climate leader, not because of its contribution to the problem, but because it is in the interests of all. Now, this is where I think India has to frame its climate action on a co-benefit approach, on what works for us in India, and that is why we are doing these actions. We know that we have horrendous air pollution in our cities, a lot because of the burning of coal. We know we need to move out of small boilers, inefficient boilers, move to green energy systems. So I think we need to lay out our own roadmap in our interests, and we need to remind the world of both the catastrophe that awaits it and the need to do much more.
Right. So you're saying on the domestic front, we need to lay out a roadmap and lead this fight against pollution, against individuals, and I believe, several developed nations as well. Yes, there has to be a comprehensive strategy that the Prime Minister also spoke about in a statement ahead of the summit, Mr. Goenka. But a growing sense is that the onus is being put only on the developing nations. Somehow it looks like the developed nations are trying to run away from their responsibility.
Absolutely right. I think India has to play its role and put its foot down and say that we will not be bullied by the so-called developed countries. I think the question of equity is very, very important, and I really think that the world has to stabilize its CO2 emissions based on per capita emissions of maybe 4 tons of carbon per year, and I think the historical emissions also need to be factored into the equation. I also think that at the national level, our Environment Ministry has to change its approach towards allowing projects in the name of development to actually protecting the environment. And I think issues like pollution and so on need to be addressed on priority. And I also think that it's really the time for action and not the time for talking anymore. I think this whole thing about 2030 and 2050, etc., is not really the right approach. I think everybody really has to seriously start cutting their emissions right now and put their money where their mouth is. India cannot be made to pay for the mistakes of the so-called developed countries.
Mr. Jha, is that what the developed nations are doing? By setting this net zero emission target 2050, are they buying more time? And in the process, what we will witness is a rise in the temperature. What we'll witness is more emission. Is that the case?
I think, this entire net zero thing is a huge scam because, it's almost like changing the goal post. Because what net zero effectively means that you're allowed to pollute till the time that you're able to absorb that emission or through the trees or through technology and everything else. I think the problem here is not about what India, there are twofold issues. One is for India to demand appropriate action and hold accountability of these countries that are the historical polluters. 70% of emissions actually have come from these 7 countries that are actually now pitching for net zero. That's one thing. And the other is like what Sunita and Vandana ji also talked about, that at the end of the day, it is not just about what the world is doing, it's also about what we are doing. So maybe one is to negotiate at the global level what a better and equitable and a just climate pact is, but at the same time, we have ourselves seen the impact of climate. And, in last 1 month, we've seen what's actually happened in Kerala, Uttarakhand, Darjeeling, in parts of Himachal. So it's only in our interest to have our own local plan at the same time. We just can't depend. But yes, a lot of money has to come from the first world because they are the ones. Polluter has to pay. Polluter cannot be shifting the goalpost. I think it's very, very brave and correct on the part of Indian government to really reject this net zero farce, because that's not what will actually save the planet. Save the planet will be to really transfer technology, transfer finance, and to really look at developing a collective, comprehensive, continuous roadmap to address climate change. India is at the receiving end of the crimes of these 7 big countries. These 7 countries who actually have, as I said, 70% of emissions, and they will continue to do so in many, many ways, in some way or the other.
And that's why India's stand, as far as the entire focus on Prime Minister's speech is concerned, is going to be climate justice for climate change. But Vandana, Shiva, my question is, to what extent do you think this is going to be received by the participating nations?
Well, this treaty has been in place since 1992. I think anyone who's thinking, oh my gosh, 26th COP will suddenly create miracles, when there are those vested interests who would like to block any responsibility, we should just look at how it's been downhill since the early days of the UNFCCC. So no matter what, any personal position or any national position, the rich have tricks up their sleeves. I would only add that yes, renewable energy is very high on the national agenda. But my work for the last decade and a half recognized that the issue of ecological agriculture, of biodiversity, of the biosphere being the place where we solve the atmospheric problem, that the biosphere creates the climate and the biosphere can cool the planet, but also grow more food. Hunger is a big issue for us. And the data is clear. These commitments were made in Paris that the soil is the richest reservoir of carbon dioxide, and in the soil, it becomes fertility. It becomes food security. So we've got to draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, put it through the plants into the soil. And the potential is huge. All we really need is to draw down about 26 gigatons per annum in order to reverse climate change, which means repair the cycle that is broken. The research around the world with ecological agriculture, organic farming, regenerative organic farming, which puts organic matter back in the soil and builds up the soil, is showing that the potential is 179 gigatons, 108 gigatons. We've done soil studies on our farm. We've increased soil organic matter content 100% and increased the zinc, we've increased the magnesium, we've increased the nitrogen, the phosphorus, potassium. So ecological agriculture is the blind spot. And those who have blocked any responsibility, you know, polluter pays was a principle negotiated at Rio. The polluters have always skipped paying for the pollution they have caused. Worse, they are now trying to make pollution their new market. And this is what, for me as an environmentalist, as an ecologist, as a scientist, is absolutely outrageous. You can't have a net zero.
Describing this. I want to bring in Ms. Narayan once again, and the question is your views on the net zero campaign. What do you think should India do?
So I think net zero is really a diversionary tool. I mean, diversionary tactic of the North. I mean, the fact is, what do we mean by net zero? IPCC says, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which framed the concept of net zero, says the world must move to net zero in 2050. Now, if the developed world is moving to net zero in 2050, surely India cannot be expected to do so. So yes, India can and must give a commitment for net zero, but that can only be 10 years after China. That would be 2070. Now that's really what the world has to sit back and understand. That's the nature of the inequity on climate change. And so I think instead of focusing on net zero, the entire world, including the rich world, should stop the chorus on net zero and start a new chorus on 2030. What are we going to do now? 2050 is too far away.
Mr. Goenka, do you think this net zero campaign, the terminology which is being used is just an empty phrase? Also, are the developed nations only trying to dilute the principle of equity by pushing for this?
Yes, I think so. I think that this is a diversionary tactic. I don't think India should fall for it. And as I said earlier, I think the time for action is long overdue, and we can't keep postponing deadlines and buying time and trying to bully other countries into doing what they want us to do. I think India really needs to fight back. I think India should forget about even 2070 for net zero. I think we have to take our own decisions depending on what the country really needs. I think in terms of renewable energy, we are on the right path, and I really think that if we actually now shift the focus of renewable energy to rooftop solar instead of these highly centralized renewable energy plants, that might actually be a more workable option for the country. And I really think you need to factor climate change considerations into the decision-making process. I don't think that is really happening in India or in other parts of the world. But I think net zero 2050 is something that we need to reject outright.
Viblinduja, do you share that view? Instead of setting these long-term goals, we need to act now. That should be the mantra, and for which the developed nations need to support the developing nations, not just put onus on them, but like countries like India also need to bargain hard, because what we need is a financial package as well, along with technology transfer.
Absolutely right. So it's not it's a mix of short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals that we all need to have individually. As India as a country needs a goal, short-term, medium-term, and long-term, and the world needs a goal, short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And it's very, very important that there is efficient and honest hand-holding that is done by the first world. The North is trying to bully the South. Traditional historical polluters are getting away by not even paying that 100 billion that they had promised. If you actually look at the report that Oxfam has come up with, that 100 billion that was actually promised, a lot of that has gone in some random projects like road construction and things that don't even qualify to be climate investment in that sense. So, I think the first world is also facing climate change. Of course, India is facing extreme climate change. India needs to act locally in its own interest and not just to convince an America or Europe in that sense. But yes, these 7 countries, OECD countries, these rich nations who've actually polluted, and a lot of their emission is still in the air that we talk about. India's contribution is 3% and not more than that. But if India starts, on that roadmap of how an American way of development has been, there will be no world left at all. So I think it's in the interest of everyone to encourage and enable India to go on a green path or a carbon neutral path. And it is a question of justice. India's population, and there are reports that says 80% of India's population is vulnerable to climate change. And we've seen that happen, be it farmers or poor people or otherwise. So we need to act individually as well as collectively when it comes to issues of climate change.
So a blueprint on the domestic front, lead this fight on the global platform, and at the same time, responsibility and accountability needs to be fixed of the bigger polluters instead of putting onus on developing nations. Thank you very much, Mr. Goenka, Mr. Jha, Vandana, Shiva and Ms. Sunitanarayan for joining us on the broadcast with your views.